Welcome, guys, to Self-Evident Podcast. I am Mike. You may notice something's different. I am sitting in the chair of Massey, who is not here tonight. He actually has a board meeting. Our guest tonight is Paul Garner. He is a good friend of ours. He's here at the church. The cool thing about this is we get to interview people that aren't necessarily known in the wider sphere, yet still have so much to give and to provide. And so we want to give these people a platform to really have discussions with them, because we truly do believe that they have something to give us, something to talk about, something that they're very passionate about. So we're going to get into that. Couple of housekeeping tips. It is the end of the year. One of the reasons Massey's having a board meeting is we have the end of the year newsletter coming out. So be watching for that. If you'd like to receive it, let us know. We'll get one out to you. This gives you our donation list of what we're looking for. Some of the things we're looking for. We're looking for a laptop. We're looking for money for travel expenses. We're hoping to hire an assistant. So if you'd like to donate, please wait for that newsletter, or you can always go to Patreon. If you want to get podcast specific, you can donate on the Patreon, or you can write in when you contact us, hey, I want my money to go to the podcast. So please feel free to donate. We would love to have that to help us continue what we're doing. So now that housekeeping is out of the way, Paul, how are you doing?
Doing great, Mike. Good to see you, man.
Good to see you, too. It's actually been a while since we've been able to sit and chat. So when I had invited you on, I wanted to pick something that I thought you would be able to have a really good discussion on. And I mean, there's a lot of things that you can have a good discussion on. But I thought America's role internationally would be a good topic, because there aren't a ton of people that can talk about it and are well-versed in what's going on in the world and how America relates. So just to get it started off, what do you think, if we were to have a philosophy for America, what do you think that philosophy should be? Or let me pull that back. We'll keep opinion out of it for a second. What do you think that philosophy is right now on the American stage, especially with Trump and everybody's mentioning how much he's making waves and he's causing this stir and this chaos amongst the other nations? What do you think his philosophy is? What do you think our nation's doing right now?
Well, I think that Trump is doing something different that's been done, that hasn't been done for decades even. What he's doing is putting America first in terms of our government's agenda. And that has offended lots of people. But Trump is not being exclusive about that. He's not being prideful. He's not being arrogant. What he's doing is he's suggesting that every president of every country should be a champion for their country. And as he once said around the Paris Climate Accords, he said that I was elected to be the president of the people in Pittsburgh, not the people in Paris. And so, but that doesn't mean he thinks that the president of France is a bad guy or doing a bad job. It's just that the president of France should be a champion for his own people and not try to become a member of a club of elites leading multiple countries around the world. And prior to Trump, there was this tendency to go globalizing, where the sovereignty of each country was intended to be subordinate to some kind of global power structure, power and authority structure. And Trump has reversed that course tremendously. And, of course, those people who favored that course are extremely upset about it, both people inside our country as well as other countries as well. They just think that America First is a bad idea because they treat America First as though it's an assault on their countries, when it isn't really.
No, and I think you're watching kind of this rise of that dirty word populism. You know, that word has become so evil because somehow it's become synonymous with Nazis and you know, this radical far right agenda.
Sure.
But you saw Brexit happening right around the same time as Trump.
Right.
You
Right.
know, and when I was watching it, I was sitting back and going, okay, so what happened with Trump? It's not just us. There seems to be this undercurrent against centralizing governments. And you've watched in Italy, in France, Marie Le Pen did better than they thought she was going to. She got more favor than they thought she was going to.
Right.
You know, and it seems that there's this groundswell of, especially after the EU.
Sure.
The EU really just bungles the whole thing, and everybody goes, I don't know that I want to be a part of that.
Right. Well, if you consider that the EU is a little bit like the United States in a way, we have 50 states. They have, 15 countries, something like that in the EU. But whenever you have an association of countries or states like that, those countries or states have to subordinate their national sovereignty to a higher power. In the U.S., we did that to the federal government back in 1789, and the EU did it back in the 1980s. And there's stiff requirements to join the EU. And each country has to surrender their currency.
That's. What do you make of that? Do you think it's this true consolidation of we want a single nation at some point?
Well, I think everybody was short-sighted about that because it sounded like a great package deal where labor could move easily across national borders without visas, without special authentication, things like this. So wherever the best jobs were, that labor could go anywhere in Europe to take those jobs. And that sounded like a really great deal. And not just labor, also capital of all resources. Money could to go across borders because they all had the same currency. And that all sounded like a great deal. And in theory, it should work. The problem is you get a country like Greece, who a couple of years ago went through a terrible financial crisis, and they have a socialist government there where so many people live off the dole. And they call it a pension, but it's really just a dole. But they could not solve their own financial problems because they didn't have their own currency, the drachma that they used to have there. And so if you don't have your own currency, you don't have control over its value. Other countries that are not in a union like that and still have their own currency can actually devalue their own currency, change the exchange rate, which solves some debt problems. Yeah. And Greece could have done that if they had their own currency.
There's I'll ask you, and if you don't want to get too far into it, that's fine. But devaluation of currency is something that interests me, the economic side of it.
Sure.
This idea that, well, if we devalue the currency, if we keep pumping money in, it'll basically crush the debt because we've got more dollars to throw at the debt.
That's right. Right.
And I've always come from the economic side of this is going to collapse at some point.
Everybody loses value when you do that.
Yeah. The one argument that I've had a hard time getting around is Japan, who's been doing quantitative easing for almost 40 years now.
Right.
And they had their economy hasn't grown, but it
hasn't collapsed either. Right.
You know, so is that something you see is actually beneficial to be able to devalue a currency?
In isolation, I would say devaluing currency is not a good practice. But the problem is that it's not in isolation. If you have your government going heavily into debt, that's the flip side of the currency problem. And you need the currency to be able to pay the debt. And if you go into debt more and more, you need to adjust your currency in order to make those payments properly, especially if your economy is not growing enough to throw off the cash to be able to pay the debt. So devaluing currency is a terrible idea in principle because currency should float according to the global markets. And behind that currency is your own economy.
Yeah.
If your GDP is great, you're going to have strong currency and it'll be in demand and it'll be able to buy more stuff and you'll need less debt. But if your economy is not doing well enough and your spending is exorbitant, then your currency is not going to be able to support that.
Which it's almost like you're trying to outrun yourself at that point.
Yeah.
You're hoping your economy will keep up in order to support the devaluation.
Right.
And I mean, I'm a purist, so I go, well, if we had, a gold standard or something, instead of having fiat currency holding up fiat currency.
Right.
And that's, it kind of tying back into the EU. That was one of the things that I saw was you've now connected these 16 economies or whatever together.
Mm-hmm.
And exactly what my concern was what happened with Greece was you had one who really started falling, despite the single currency, and all of a sudden now the other countries have to, well, they're either going to pull us down with them or we've got to save them. And,
that's right.
And Germany basically said we don't want to.
Right. Right.
Sink yourself.
Yeah, but they still had to contribute.
Yeah.
They had their banks. It wasn't actually the national governments, but the banks. They were of all of these countries. Germany, in particular, the richest countries, Britain, Germany, and France, all had to help bail out Greece.
Yeah.
And I think that led to Brexit. The people of Britain had lost their sovereignty to the EU government in Brussels, and the people were angry about that.
Huh, I didn't think about the economic side of it because the whole time I was watching Brexit, I was watching the political side of it, and there were plenty of people who I was reading to, who were talking a lot about the lack of representation.
Yeah, certainly.
You send your MEPs, but guess what? They can't do anything.
That's right.
The council is the one who decides whether or not the law is going to go into effect.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't thought about the economic side of it, where Great Britain their banks were having to shell out cash to help float Greece.
Right.
The people
along
aren't
with
gonna
other
be happy
countries.
with
Yeah,
it.
yeah. And then the people of Britain didn't feel like they had a voice in that whole process. Not to mention the fact that there was a global recession around 2007, 8, 9, and that still allowed labor to go wherever the jobs were. So the people of Britain were forced to allow unfettered immigration into their country from other European countries. And if those countries had already admitted people from Syria, for example, they would be easily transferred or mobile within the EU. So a lot of jobs went away from people who were native to Britain. So they were a little angry about that.
And personally, I would say rightfully so.
Yeah.
I mean, we're witnessing a very similar event in America, which it's interesting that now some politicians are starting to come out and say, okay, maybe this isn't such a great thing.
Right.
And if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Hillary Clinton was looking at Europe and Germany and saying, okay, mass migration might not be the best thing for them.
She said that recently, yeah.
But she kept silent about America.
Right.
Yeah.
If you look back at the history of Hillary Clinton and a lot of politicians, they said something different a few years ago.
Yeah.
Even President Obama sounded exactly like President Trump about the border, going back about 8 or 10 years. And so he and President Trump agreed at one point about what should be done about the border.
Yeah.
And yet then he changes his mind. That's one good thing about Trump as well, is that I haven't seen him actually change his mind on a significant issue.
Yeah.
He's made some promises during the campaign, and he's one of the few politicians I've seen so far that's really trying to keep him.
And Massey and I were talking about that, and I told him, I was like, one of the things I have to respect about Trump is that he may tell blusters, it's the largest crowd ever, but he's a New Yorker. He's a businessman.
Big. Everything's big.
Everything's
the big apple.
Bluster. It's all the greatest ever. If you listen to him talk, every other word is best ever. Or
That's
greatest ever, largest.
Right.
But on the policies, I haven't seen him lie.
No.
He's, he says what he wants to do, and he tends to try and go for it. Now, do I agree on everything he's doing? No. But I can't help but say the guy's been consistent.
Yeah.
He's been a lot more consistent than pretty much any other presidents we've had in a long time.
For those of us who voted for him, we're pleased that we don't have that our votes were not wasted.
Yeah.
I voted Republican all but one election in my life, and I was perpetually disappointed by the actions of the candidates once they were elected, that they didn't follow through on the things that I voted for them for.
Yeah.
So
what year was it that you didn't vote Republican?
that was 1976 when President Carter was running. I voted for him. The only Democrat in my life that I've ever done that with.
Really?
Yeah. And that turned out to be a huge disappointment as well.
I was going to say, how do you feel now?
Yeah.
After the Carter
huge
vote?
disappointment. I voted for him because he was very open about his faith.
Yeah.
He had a great walk with God, with Jesus, and he's a tremendous humanitarian as well.
That's true.
His heart's in the right place. And I just felt an affinity with him as a Christian that I should vote for him. But that taught me an interesting lesson about being a Christian in America, that just because a person is a Christian and holds Christian values does not mean that they are properly equipped for any particular office.
Yeah.
We know that with pastors and school teachers and even worship leaders. It's also true of presidents. Just because a person is a Christian doesn't make them ideal to be president.
Yeah.
And so even if somebody's not a Christian, that doesn't make them immediately disqualified from the office of president.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you make a good point with Christians not necessarily being right for office, especially a position like president, because it's so easy to forget what your limitations are.
Yeah.
In that role. And often, like we saw with Carter, there was this Christian ethic that got intermixed into an attempt to do things that government was really not meant to be doing,
Right.
and wasn't put there for. And
Sure.
a lot of times, like Massey and I will say a lot, people think we want a theocracy. We actually don't.
No, we
do
don't.
not. We want Christians who know the role well and have good character being in office. That's much different from having a Christian theocracy in
Absolutely.
power.
Yeah.
And to look at it that way, of the role, the position, that kind of thing, you have to weigh your presidents carefully. Now, then it becomes the flip with Trump, where we don't see the morals or the qualities that we really want to see in our leaders. And people have pointed at us and said, you're supporting this guy who cheated on his wife and is on his third marriage.
Sure.
I don't have a defense for that.
Well, here's a thought to consider. We have a man in office right now who does not have a good moral track record.
No.
And his respect for women has been suspect along the way. However, before him, we had 8 years of President Obama, for whom he apparently has led a mostly upstanding moral life. Okay, not his Christian faith is suspect, but I don't want to cast any decisions about that because I don't really know. Yeah. But he had a respectable moral reputation, and yet he presided over 8 years of destruction of American values. And if I even go back further to President George W. Bush, as much as I voted for him twice, I believe he did a lot of great things, but he also undermined our liberty in America with the Patriot Act.
Absolutely.
So he's a solid Christian, a high moral individual, faithful in service to this country throughout his life, just like his father was. And yet, because of 9/11, he put sort of the safety of Americans ahead of our liberty, and he undermined liberty in profound ways in this country. So voting for a man because he is a Christian or not is not going to tell you what kind of president he's going to be. Voting for a man because he's some race, white, black, Asian, Latin, whatever, is also a very poor foundation for decision making. So a lot of people voted for President Obama just because he was black. He was the first black president. How exciting America has progressed so far. What we ended up with is somebody who undermined our liberty.
Mm-hmm.
And he undermined our foreign policy tremendously as well.
Yeah, and that side note is very valuable of saying voting for somebody just because of their race isn't all that far off from voting for somebody just because they're Christian.
Right.
They may not be best suited for the role.
That's right.
But getting back into the foreign policy, you had mentioned, Obama, his foreign policy. Let's contrast that, because there were a lot of people who were very excited for Obama's foreign policy. He did what conservatives dubbed the apology tour. He went all around to Middle East nations, basically apologizing for us being America. What did you see? What did you notice during those 8 years of foreign policy? And where do you think it left us?
Well, part of it, too, is that President Obama was not a courageous person. And when it comes to foreign policy, you have to have a person of strength and courage to hold a ground of principle in the face of other countries who are trying to get their own way. Yeah. It's a little bit, negotiation, everybody's coming to the table with the idea of their own interests. But in fact, what ended up happening is that he was not a courageous man. He would not stand his ground against other countries that would try to push us around. And so we ended up, the greatest example of this is the payment to Iran over the Iran nuclear deal. We paid them billions of dollars in cash, pallets of cash we gave to them in a kind of plea. He didn't negotiate from a hard standpoint. He basically tried to bribe them into good behavior with this billions of dollars, which is just foolish, because they ended up using that money to fund more terrorism in Syria, in Lebanon, among the Palestinians in Israel as well. Yeah. So we all knew that was going to happen. And there's no evidence whatsoever that they are holding their side of the bargain about not developing nuclear weapons.
No, and the economic woes that they're going through right now, obviously we have a big role to play in that by our sanctions, but their own people are pointing out, we're starving and you're funneling all this money to terrorism.
Right.
And I do believe the hammer is going to drop at some point for Iran. What I'm concerned about is that Iran will suddenly turn around and blame us and Israel as the scapegoats, which I think this is a bit of a segue. So I wanted to cover Israel with you because, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so feel free to clear this up. But I think both of us are cooperate with other nations, but America first.
Absolutely.
In a sense.
Yeah.
Where do you think Israel fits into that?
Well, it's kind of an ironic part, because while I really like George Washington's view of foreign policy, where he said that nations don't have friends, they have interests. And mostly he was not an isolationist, but he was definitely one who said, we don't want to get involved in these alliances where we take one side or the other. But Israel is more than an interest to us. Israel is a friend. And from a Christian standpoint, Israel even more than that. It's our spiritual heritage. That's where Jesus came from. That's where our faith originated. Whether or not somebody believes that the church is the new Israel or not is not relevant really for politics. It's more of a theological question. But the fact that President Trump has moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is a huge thing. And that goes back to the example of the difference between Obama and Trump as well. The decree to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem happened way back in the 90s. And so Congress passed that. But no president has ever followed through on that congressional act to do that. Yeah. And Trump is the first one who had the courage to do it. Now, the implication for Obama is that he was more sympathetic to the Palestinians and to other Muslim causes around the world. Yeah. He was soft on ISIS, soft on Al-Qaeda, and Trump has made more headway in fighting those extremist forces and supporting Israel at the same time.
So why, well, let me stick on Israel for a second. We'll get to ISIS and all of that in a second. That was something that I really applauded Trump to do, because every president before him had paid lip service to it. Of
yes,
we'll move it, and then they just tried to forget about it. And Trump was the first one to go, no, we're moving it.
Right.
And he's hard-headed enough to go ahead and do it if he wants to do it.
Yeah, he's courageous and strong. Yeah,
we always, Massey and I always joke, we don't want to talk about Trump on the podcast. I mean, everybody talks about Trump, but international politics, there's no way you can get around
you
it
can't
when you're talking about America. And so that's one of the things I value about him on the global stage is it's almost like he just doesn't care, and he doesn't have fear about other countries, other leaders.
Right.
There's almost this ignorant brashness to him, which I know drives people on the left crazy.
Right.
They see him and they go, this guy is complete ignoramus. He has no idea what he's going to do. He's going to end the world. Yeah. And I've had those moments where I've kind of like, oh, what are you doing? But at the same time, I value that he's the type of guy that can walk into the EU or walk into NATO and tell them the truth.
Right.
Say, you're not paying your fair share.
That's right.
Fair share.
Right.
You know,
right.
Pay up or we're done.
Right. And that's straight out of his book, The Art of the Deal, as well, because there is something about his negotiating style that where he goes in with the most extreme presentation of an idea. He remember, it wasn't just the 2% he was trying to get NATO countries to pay. That was sort of the baseline. Then he said, maybe we should raise it to maybe 3.2%. So that's his sort of negotiating thing. If you don't pay up on the 2%, we're going to make it 3.2%, and see how you like that. It's that kind of negotiating style, and he does this a lot with a lot of his negotiating, where he comes out with some crazy idea. We're going to make Mexico pay for the wall. Well, that seems unlikely in a direct format. There might be other ways that he thinks he's going to get to be able to pay for that. But the idea is that he goes extreme for the negotiation, and then he comes out of it with a result that is more aligned to what he really wanted and what we all really want. So it's a negotiating style more than anything.
So with his negotiating style, what do you think of the tariff war that he's got going on with China right now?
Yeah.
I knew that would be a juicy one for you.
Absolutely. Well, part of it is that I don't think he's going to be quite as successful with China as he has been with Mexico and Canada, with the new MCC USA, something like that.
Yeah, I don't remember what it's called, but
right,
yeah,
but the new NAFTA, the replacement for NAFTA.
Yeah,
right. I don't think he's going to be as successful with China as he has been with the new NAFTA, and part of the reason for that is that China's got a very long range view of their place in the world and in history. They already have a roadmap going out 50 years in terms of their future, and that includes global dominance. They've got mile markers along the way, milestones of where they expect to be in 2025, and then 2030, 2040, and all of it. And they're operating that strategy around the world. Belt and road strategy, where they are actually working their way westward from their own country and on land, doing the old Silk Road through Asia into Europe for trade. And then also they've got a sea-bound one where they are dominating in the South China Sea and then making relationships with all of their neighbors in Southeast Asia, going through to India. And that's the belt part of that Belt and Road. All the way along, they're using their billions of dollars in revenue to buy countries' loyalties.
Yeah.
And if they can't, so they're loaning the money, and if the countries can't pay them back, it's a little bit like a loan shark, because they're going to come and they're going to collect, and then these countries are going to have to give up some assets along the way.
So that being said, America is playing a much shorter game with that.
Yes.
America is coming in saying, well, you need us, so come to the table and deal with us.
Right. I don't think they will.
And the facts that they're expanding and spreading, and they're looking 50 years out, they're saying, well, as long as we get these loyalties from these 100 other countries, well, that takes care of America if we lose America.
Right.
So I kind of wonder if they're fine with watching America go off into the distance, because it actually strengthens them in the long run.
Right.
And America, despite what people think, America needs China more than we're willing to admit, I believe.
Yep.
Especially with the fact that our manufacturing is a shell of what it used to be.
Right.
And China has, and those Eastern Asian countries have really taken over our manufacturing. So if China starts really having stronger control over countries like Taiwan, you know, Thailand, like
Vietnam,
we could be in real trouble.
We could. I think that the trouble part is still a distance away, maybe 40, 50 years, but it's coming.
Yeah.
No country can sustain the kind of role in history that the United States has hoped for. Democracy has never lasted in any country in all of history more than 200 years.
That's true.
And we're aging well past that now. So even the Roman Empire that started off as a democratic republic, the republic part of the Roman Empire lasted less than 200 years. So republics don't last that long. It doesn't have a long shelf life. So it's possible in the competition of the world. People thought the British Empire was going to last forever. They used to say that the sun never sets on the British Empire.
That's true.
And yet it was World War I that really took them apart, and World War II was the last hurrah for the British Empire. Yeah. And a new empire rose up, and it happened to be the United States. But it could have been Russia or China.
That's true. And America really rose off the dying back of Britain.
Yes.
You know, Britain was so enveloped in World War I and World War II, and we sat back and tried to avoid it at all costs, because hey, we'll sell weapons to everybody. We'll manufacture for you guys, no problem.
Well, consider this. I have had this debate with a few people before, particularly relative to World War II and our aid coming to the aid of Europe at that time. The entire reason we had to go in to help them is that after World War I, Britain and France unilaterally disarmed. After the Treaty of Versailles, after World War I, where Germany was forced to pay reparations, and Germany was supposed to pay attention to these rules, they couldn't rebuild their military, all those kinds of things. Well, Germany violated all those rules after Hitler came around in the early 1930s, but Britain and France had disarmed. So they could not go in and hold Germany accountable for these treaty violations. Yeah. And so it was a stupid policy on the part of Britain and France that they disarmed themselves because they were tired of war. And I couldn't blame them for being tired of war.
Yeah.
I mean, World War I was a terrible, terrible event in their history. Yeah. But the fact that they disarmed caused World War II because they were not able to defend themselves against a second rise of the German government, the Third Reich.
And the election of soft politicians to support that, especially Neville Chamberlain will probably go down as one of the
worst.
One of the
He's the
worst.
Jimmy Carter of Britain.
He really is. Like, people look at him and go, soft, you know? And without a strong leader, you're going to end up having to face a despot at some point.
Right. Ronald Reagan proved that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Peace through strength.
Absolutely. And one of the things everybody hammered Reagan for was that he wouldn't back down.
That's right.
He wouldn't give in. And that's one of the other things I wanted to talk to you about is that spread of communism. So we're talking about America, international relations. Vietnam War was such a tumultuous topic.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, we don't have any reason to be there. And then there's the smaller side that was saying, no, we need to be there to thwart communism back at its origins,
Yeah.
to try and hem it in.
That was a lot of marketing. I actually am old enough to have grown up during the Vietnam War,
Yeah.
and a lot. I didn't know this at the time in the 1960s. I was still a kid, but I was still pretty paying attention to things, and I didn't realize at the time that whole domino theory about the countries falling to communism was mostly marketing.
Really?
Yeah, because the only reason we ended up in the Vietnam War was not because of communism; it's because France invited us to come and help.
Huh.
Because the French were already there. The
Yeah.
French were already fighting this battle against the insurgents, communist insurgents supported by China. Basically a little proxy war kind of thing going on. And the French were getting beat up terribly, and so they asked for help. And so we sent a few advisors. Well, our advisors got hurt. And so President Kennedy at one point said, hey, no, we're just going to bring it back. We're not going to get involved, but it turns out that some event happened where we had to send more troops rather than taking the troops out, and it just drew us in further and further. And so the domino theory was largely a marketing tool by Secretary of Defense McNamara, who was in favor of us continuing in that war and defeating communism.
Do you think he actually believed it, or he?
Yes, well, yeah, I do believe that McNamara believed in defeating communism, and I think most of America did at the time as well. The communist threat was pretty much something that the 20th century was well aware of, going back even to the early in the 20th century. But after World War II, we had conceded territory to Stalin as a communist leader, and then Mao came to power in China, and the Free Chinese left to form Formosa at the time, that became Taiwan. And so America was very afraid of communists. We had our communist trials and things like that. So it was on our minds. So it was not a huge stretch to convince the American people that we're fighting against the fall of more countries to communism.
Which we saw that type of marketing so successful in World War II, because you had a real threat, a real danger to the world, and I've noticed that that's become the MO from there on out. Is this is a danger to the rest of the world? We must fight this. So where does America draw that line then?
That's part of the problem with communism is that we don't allow enough time for it to implode and fall in on itself.
Let it kill itself.
Yes, exactly. I mean, look at what happened to the Soviet Union. They imploded and collapsed on themselves. Look at Venezuela. It's collapsing on itself. Communism and even extreme socialism is not sustainable. It's not a sustainable model. Maggie Thatcher, former Prime Minister of Britain, said that the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money.
Exactly.
And you can't do that. So communism and socialism will always collapse on itself. The problem is we don't want to wait for it. So we want to use force to try to stop it, prevent it, force its collapse, however we want to do it. And some countries collapse quicker than others. Venezuela was, wow, that was fast.
It was fast, which the collapse of oil prices really, it was the death knell for Venezuela. I think if oil prices had stayed, Venezuela would have taken 30, 40 more years to really do itself in.
Yeah, that's true.
But the collapse of oil fell, and then they doubled down on socialism.
Part of it is, too, that the Vietnam War was so decimating to our national identity. I remember coming out of the 70s, our country was so demoralized. Along the same line, I graduated from high school in 74, and that was the same year as the end of the war and the end of the draft. So men still had to register for the draft, but you were not likely to be drafted anymore because the soldiers were coming home. But that was after 57,000 Americans were killed in that war, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. And even Agent Orange is still affecting that country today. The defoliation, it's still causing a lot of birth defects. So that war was devastating. And then in the early 1970s, we had a recession. We had gas lines because the Arab countries in the Middle East, who dominated the oil industry, were embargoing us. And so there were gas lines. We had been used to paying 25 cents a gallon for gas. It spiked 5 times that to $1.25. Sounds great nowadays. We'd love to have that again, but it was 5 times what we had been used to.
Especially in 1970s dollars.
Right.
That's expensive.
And you got your gas based on the ending number in your license plate, if it was odd or even. And odds got their gas one day, evens got them the other day. So we were beginning to feel like a communist country with the shortages that were happening in that thing. So
the loss of national identity. When you're saying that, one of the things that I connected to that is the fact that there wasn't an agreed upon moral reason to be in Vietnam.
That's right.
World War II, especially after Pearl Harbor, everybody, yes,
absolutely,
we need to do this.
Right.
And you couple that with the recession, you couple that with the embargoes, you couple that honestly with the sexual revolution in the late 60s and this whole turning everything on its head and getting rid of authority, and you really started this pinball of loss of national identity. Do you see that as playing itself out? We had the 70s, the next decades after that. Do you think we gained some type of national identity? Did we ever get back? Is it losing even worse?
I think it's similar to what President Reagan once said, that liberty is not something that we have in our blood. We have to teach it to each generation one at a time. And that's true about national identity as well. I think that we have to keep relearning what our identity is with each generation. And there are plenty of people out there who are wanting to be the arbiter of what national identity it means. I mean, we've gone through a stage recently with a lot of people in the public tearing down statues of key figures in our history just because they somehow offended somebody. And they're trying to say that being white is an offensive thing, that there's privilege just by being white, which is just absurd. But people are trying to define what our new identity is going to be. And so it changes with each generation, and we have to guard what we think is valuable with each generation. But we are certainly not the greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw wrote about. We're not that generation anymore. We're not that country anymore. We were so unified around World War II that we really felt like we had a common enemy, and we joined together. Young men were lying about their age so that they could enlist in the military at an earlier age. Nowadays, we are the first generation of people where there's whole families of men and women who have never served. And that includes me, too, by the way. I never served in the military, unfortunately. So that's a whole generation who have never served in that way.
Yeah.
And it does affect our identity.
It does. There's a theory, which this is a bit of a rabbit trail, but there's a theory that when you have a small tribe, all of the men really have to be part of the defensive force to protect the women and children. As the tribe grows, you start to have some men that don't have to be part of the protection. They can stay in the center square.
Sure.
As that tribe continues to grow and grow and grow, you have less people that are your defensive measure against other tribes because you have enough people to pull from. In America, we've lost that part of our identity as well, that freedom needs to be defended, and freedom is an active fight at all times to retain. And we've become apathetic to the idea that men need to grow up to value defending their country.
Right.
It's no longer we pay some type of homage to our veterans and to our military members, and it's almost like we're just doing it because we know we're supposed to. There's so many more people now that just it is what it is. They're just always off, and this gets into the international stage. They're just off in some other country trying to enforce American imperialism.
Right. But that's not how it's cast. The marketing is they're defending our freedom.
Yes.
And that's a lie.
Yes.
There are some people who feel that fighting over there keeps them from keeps us here from having to fight here against those extremists, jihadists, whatever you want to call them. And so that process, we've delegated our defense to others. And I think that's the critical component. We have grown so large that we are now specializing and delegating defense of ourselves to police, defense of our nation to our soldiers, and sending them places all over the world. And we're not taking responsibility to do that anymore for us. We're just going to have a good time and let the specialists handle that.
So you think taking the fight to, say, Afghanistan, ISIS doorstep, you think that's a wrong decision?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. It's very easy that war could have been done in a matter of, I don't know, a couple of months. I'm not a military strategist, but all we really needed to do is to drop some ordnance on there. Because think about it, the Taliban that was controlling that country in those days is still there. Yeah. They're not governing the whole country. But if you look at the history of Afghanistan, they have never had a solitary government that has ruled over them. They have been a country of warlords for their entire existence. And now we're going to go in there and implement a single sovereign government over all of the warlords? I don't think so. But we've spent over $1 trillion over there trying to enforce our will. And the fact is, we don't belong there. And our soldiers don't deserve to die there. I've often said that the greatest honor we can bestow on all of our military members is to stop wasting their lives on useless wars.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. It's quite a prideful arrogance for us to watch what the Russians tried to do.
Yeah.
In Afghanistan. Well, we can do it better. You can't do it. It's such a, like you said, it's such a split out nation. It's divided into so many parts.
Right.
And this is just getting into the mechanics of it, but really the value comes down to there's no reason for us to be there.
That's right.
And people will bring up, well, ISIS, we need to stop ISIS, we need to contain
But we
ISIS.
Created ISIS.
But
because
ISIS
we interfered in Iraq, bringing down Saddam Hussein, regardless of what we think the reasons were, true or not true, is that we left a vacuum in that country, and ISIS rose up out of that, just like Al-Qaeda rose up out of Afghanistan. We trained Al-Qaeda by our own CIA people, our own CIA agents in that country to fight against the Russians. And when the Russians left, Al-Qaeda had nothing to do, so they turned around and focused on us.
Yeah.
And they were well trained to bring down the Twin Towers in 9/11 by our own CIA.
Yep.
So we have brought on a great deal of trouble on ourselves
by getting
involved
in global politics where we didn't need to be.
That's right.
Libya was really kind of the same issue.
Exactly. Gaddafi.
I wanted to say Gandhi. I'm like, that's not the right guy. Gaddafi, he even said, if you get rid of me, you'll have, scores of African migrants at your doorstep.
Yep.
And he was right.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely right. And there's no question Gaddafi was an evil man.
Yeah.
Just like Saddam Hussein was an evil man. The Taliban is an evil organization. Absolutely. They are evil. They're abusive. They're murderous and torturous and all those kinds of things. But it's a little bit like when Jesus tells about the idea of casting out demons. Yeah. If you cast out demons from a man, but the Holy Spirit doesn't move into him, the demons return only far worse than they ever were before.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the story of our intervention in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. I'm glad we've kind of been mostly around the perimeter of Syria, and we haven't really committed ourselves there, because that's another quagmire.
It makes me nervous that we're going to end up stepping into Syria, and we're just going to be stepping in cow dung if we do it.
Right.
And it scares me. And this whole, we have to remove Assad. We have to remove him. We have to get rid of him.
Right.
My heart breaks for the situation.
Yeah.
But, Proverbs even talks about be careful about sticking yourself in another fight, or else you're liable to get hit.
That's right. That's right. You'll pay the penalty for sure.
You know, if you try to separate two fighting dogs, you're going to get bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, like, where did this come from? And maybe you can enlighten me. Where did this idea? Do you think it's the evil economic theory of controlling, finances, controlling economic power, all of that? Do you think that's where it came from? Do you think it came from a misguided moral mission to save the world from itself? Like,
I think all of the above. I think that we became more involved in that way around the time of Teddy Roosevelt, the turn of the 20th century, where the progressives really had their birth.
Yeah.
And they thought that America was so great that we were going to accomplish great things in the coming years. And certainly the 20th century, we did accomplish a great many things. But part of that process led us to interventionist points of view, where Teddy Roosevelt leads the Rough Riders into Cuba because he was going to liberate them. And so that was just sort of the American arrogance. We did the same thing in the Philippines.
That's true.
There was this interventionist point of view because America had this, what did they call it? Manifest destiny, this whole push from the East Coast to the West Coast. And that translated into a kind of arrogance, global arrogance, that we, America, can now dispense our greatness all over the world, and everybody will be so grateful that we liberated them. And it just didn't turn out that way.
Which I hate to tie it back, but I think was fallout from World War II.
Yes. Well, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, we came in as the hero.
Yep.
And I'm not saying we weren't needed. We were obviously needed in the war. But I mean, Russia really Russia really kind of did what needed to be done. But
yeah.
But we walked away saying we did a good thing. We helped out the world. And I kind of wonder if there was a bit of a big head syndrome after that.
Well, we did something similar with World War I as well. We
That's
contributed to that war, not as significantly, but we contributed to it. But remember, as I said earlier, Britain and France brought this on themselves.
Yeah.
So it's my opinion is that that we should not have gotten involved over there.
Yeah.
Just my opinion. That goes against the greatest generation belief system. That yes, we did save Europe from the Nazis. Absolutely, we did, and we curtailed the Holocaust. Yeah. I mean, it was 6 million Jews they successfully killed, but there could have been millions more. Yeah. So there's a great show on is it Netflix called "The Man in the High Castle," and what if the Nazis had won? Yeah. And they ruled the world, and what it would be like in America if the Nazis had come over here and defeated us. Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah. It's from a science fiction author, Philip K. Dick, who also did, never mind, forget. Anyways, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And my brother is into that show, and it's not Netflix, but I think it's Hulu. It's the one I don't have. I've got Netflix,
okay.
But yeah.
Okay.
So I haven't had a chance to really watch it, but speaks glowingly of it.
Yeah.
So what would your philosophy be then, especially as a Christian? You've been, to put it cheesy, you've been elected president, overseer of America. You are now going to create the foreign policy of America, and especially your Christian values inform who you are.
Yeah.
And who God is and what God thinks about America as well as Israel and all other nations. Like, what's your overarching philosophy?
Okay. My number one value that I believe about America is liberty. It's not democracy, it's liberty, and they're not the same thing. Liberty or democracy can facilitate liberty as we were originally designed, at least from a republic standpoint. I use the word democracy more broadly, but we know we're a republic and not a democracy. Yeah. Okay. So, but in order for that to be successful, what we have to do is avoid the use of force, except in defense of ourselves and others that we see who are being abused, which is a very correctly borderline because, for example, I believe in the right to carry weapons, just the Second Amendment, but I don't believe in using a weapon as a force to steal from people, to kill them, to abuse them, to whatever. That kind of thing is a forfeiture of the whole meaning, the moral meaning behind self-defense.
Yeah.
Okay. And that goes with foreign policy as well. America absolutely should have the strongest defense known to man, and I would be supportive of whatever budget would be required for that if they didn't waste it.
Yeah.
So that's a different topic, but
Yeah.
yeah, I hate the waste in the Defense Department. But we should be unassailable by any force in the world, including China, Russia, whatever. Okay. However, what should we do about other countries? Should we come to their aid?
Yeah.
George Washington would never have approved becoming NATO allies.
Yeah.
Never, because he felt that alliances get us into other people's wars,
Which is true.
which is really true. Absolutely. So I would not get involved in the civil war of any country. So whether it was Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria, Libya, I would not do that. I also would not invade a country and overturn its ruler, even if that ruler was evil, because that's not our job. Because think about what the cost is to American people. Not only do we have to send the sons and daughters of American families to impose the force of change, we actually have to force Americans to pay for it. Mm-hmm. So right now, our 2%, or actually it's 3.6%, I think, on our NATO contributions. Yeah. That's not including the military forces that are parked in Germany, that are parked in Korea. We have military forces parked all over the world to defend these other countries when they are perfectly rich enough to support their own defense. Yeah. That's coming out of the working people's pockets of America. We are subsidizing the defense of the whole world. Yeah. What's right about that? We're not defending ourselves because there's nothing happening in the Middle East that is going to be coming here. And if it does come here, we have the budget to have a defense force of the American boundaries that could easily defend us against that.
Especially if we brought all of our people home.
That's right. Exactly.
So taking that one step further, what about foreign aid?
Again, no one has a rightful claim on American money. And the American government has no business getting involved in humanitarian activities. That is not what its job is for. Because remember that the federal government confiscates our earnings by force. Threat of force. If you get thrown in prison for not paying your taxes, that means that taxation is a threat of force. Mm-hmm. So our money is confiscated against our will to be given to people in other parts of the world who may have a legitimate need for it or may not, but I didn't agree to it. The best way to handle foreign aid is the United Way, American Cancer Society, pardon me.
Red Cross.
I'm sorry? Red Cross. Yeah. Americans are very generous. Even on top of our, $3 trillion we pay in taxes every year, we also contribute billions more to humanitarian projects. Yes, we do. Earthquakes and tsunamis and all kinds of things, and then just randomly feeding people around the world. We contribute to medical things. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are really focused on health concerns of children in Africa. Mm-hmm. Bravo. That's all voluntary money. Yeah. Nobody's forcing people to contribute to that. Americans are very generous. So I think foreign aid, no government, the American government, should not be involved in foreign aid of any kind. Basically because it involves confiscating people's earnings without their consent.
Right.
So
I totally agree. I can't put it much
you could have done this
myself.
Without me.
No, you put it perfectly. So, well, we're at about an hour. Unless you have any closing thoughts, I guess we'll.
I just believe in the idea of liberty, and liberty is more important than anything. It's our highest national value. It's not safety, it's liberty. And liberty is messy. But we have to prize it above all other things. God was the author of liberty, is the author of liberty. He gave it to us as a priceless gift in the Garden of Eden, puts the tree in there, and he says, don't eat of that. And that was not intended to trick us, but it was intended to give us an opportunity to disobey, to say no to God. That was the original choice of liberty. God gave us liberty. And liberty means I get to say no, even to God. So
That's a good way to put it.
So, and Americans make that choice all the time. Yes, God, no, God. Even those of us who follow Jesus as close as we have so far, we often say no in ways that we find ourselves disappointed later, we regret. But God gives us that liberty to say no, to not obey, to not love the way we should, because he's patient and graceful. It's not just America's highest value, it's God's. So we need to prize that gift of liberty and say, no, I'm not going to use force against you to make you do things the way I think you should.
Absolutely.
So, and that should define our foreign policy as well.
That's a very good closing point, is that when we really value liberty and we really value making your own decisions, which is liberty, suddenly our national policy takes on a whole different view, because it's no longer trying to mold other countries to our value. It's you can make your own decision and we will be an example you can look to.
That's right. That's right.
It's a difference from us making an example out of you.
Absolutely. And force is the thing that is the counter to liberty. Unless somebody is assaulting you, everybody should have the right to self-defense. Everybody, and including as much force as necessary to stop the threat. But nobody should ever use force against other people, initiate force against other people to make them do what you want them to do. And that includes paying taxes.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And we're definitely going to have you back again because there are 400 other topics I want to talk with you about, and people get a taste of those. But so thank you so much to Paul, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, you can check us out on Patreon. You can donate on there. You can get us on iTunes, YouTube, which hopefully you're watching right now, and be looking for the end of the year newsletter. If you'd like it, let us know. So thank you so much, guys. Have a great night. Love you.